I think that the biggest myth, the thing that stops a lot of people from even getting started in podcasting, is that people think that you need a lot of inherent things. For example, that you need a good voice, you need a great personality, you need to have something, like super clever to say every time. You need to be super witty, like you were saying. You need to buy expensive equipment so you sound, studio quality all the time. And I just think that's wrong. Like, you really don't need that much to get started in podcasting, and you don't need to be anyone special, like, because you've already got something special and unique to say. You just need to be able to express it in the right way. And really, the only way that you get good at expressing things in the right way is with practice.
Hey everyone, this is Devin Miller here with another episode of The Inventive Expert. I'm your host, Devin Miller, the serial entrepreneur that's grown several startups into 7- and 8-figure businesses, as well as the founder and CEO of Miller IP Law, where he helps startups and small businesses with their patents and trademarks. You ever need help with yours, just go to strategymeeting.com, grab some time with us to chat, and we're always here to help. Now, today we've got another great guest on the podcast, Carl Robinson. And Carl, we're going to talk about a few great things, a lot to do with about podcasting. So a little bit about how to start and grow a podcast, also a little bit about what is asynchronous podcasting, maybe talk a little bit about team leadership and how they're doing it with the Rumble Studios, maybe talk a little bit more generally about sales and how to do sales training and working with co-founders and letting go as a founder and being able to delegate. So it should be some great conversations and a great discussion. So with that much as an introduction, welcome on the podcast, Carl.
Hey, Devin, great to be back. How's it going?
Well, it's going well. So, and for those that didn't haven't caught it, so Carl is on our sister podcast, The Inventive Journey. So definitely encourage you to go check out that episode and go find out more about Carl's journey and how he got to where he's at today. But for those that haven't had a chance or saying, hey, I just want the short snippet or version of it, introduce yourself a bit to the audience.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Carl Robinson, co-founder, CEO of Rumble Studio. Rumble Studio is a SaaS application that helps creators, agencies, companies to create audio content like podcasts 10 times faster and easier through the magic of asynchronous interviews. So that basically means instead of running live conversations like we're doing now, you add some questions into our platform, send your guest a link, and Rumble Studio interviews them for you. Then you get all that audio back and you can put it together into a podcast, and this is really what we're focused on. We're based in France, but I'm a Brit, as you can tell, and we've got 10 people now, and we've been going since September 2020, and we're just in the beginning stages of raising our next fundraising round as well. So if there are any investors listening to this and you like what you hear, you can reach out to me at carl@rumble.studio.
Awesome. We'll definitely encourage all the investors to reach out, and a great business. So now with that is a definitely a helpful introduction, diving into a few of the topics at hand, and we'll get a little bit more into what is, or specifically asynchronous podcasting. But I think in a more general sense, podcasting is one where it seems like it certainly has gained a lot of popularity. Have this podcast. I'd say usually if I'm ever listening to something, whether it's driving or out for the morning run or anything else, I'm either one, listening to an audiobook, or two, I'm listening to a podcast. And kind of the same variation of the same thing. One is just more up to date or a longer version of the other. And but within that, podcasts have grown. There's a lot of podcasts out there, and so it's kind of one where it used to be a bit more of a niche, and now it's one where it's a bit more of a crowded field, to where now you're having to cut through the clutter. So if you're to talk to somebody that's maybe just doing a business or just for fun or for a hobby or whatever, is saying, hey, maybe I want to get into doing my own podcast or want to dive in, and how should I get started, and how, if my aspirations are to grow a bit or to actually gain an audience rather than just do it for my self-gratification, how would you get started, and or any thoughts on how you get started with the podcast and how you might go about growing it?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, first of all, pick up something you said. Actually, it feels like a crowded market, and for sure, there's the popularity of podcasts is growing exponentially. That said, I saw a really interesting stat just the other day in preparing the pitch deck, actually, for our raise, in that there's almost 2.5 million podcasts on Apple Podcasts now, but only 18% of them are active. So 82% have not released an episode in the past 30 days. So there's huge attrition in podcasting. It's a lot of work. A lot of people try try and then give up. And actually, the majority of podcasts that are released have only one episode. So a lot of people try and then just think, well, that is a lot of work, a lot more than I thought, and then they quit. And so there's only a few 100,000 active podcasts. So if you're thinking of getting into the space, don't stress about being crowded out by the big boys who've been doing it for ages. You've got something important to say. You're probably quite unique in the way that you're saying that, and the crowd is only a few 100,000 across all topics. And if you compare that against the number of websites that are out there, I think there's more than 450 million WordPress sites alone, and that doesn't stop people from putting a blog online. So I think podcasting is really early days, and you've got a great chance of building up a following if you've got anything at all interesting to say. That's probably the prerequisite, is to have something interesting that you want to give to people, or at least the willingness to bring people who do have something interesting to say onto your show. And that's a big part of what we do at Rumble. It's an interview platform. Interviews are the most popular format because you don't have to come up with all the content yourself every week. You can invite people on and they can say something interesting with you, and that gives you ideas and you can bounce off each other. So think about what it is that you're good at, what it is you want to say, what your unique message is to the world, and who can support you in that, and then put a plan together. We actually have a couple of interactive resources that you can use on Rumble Studio. If you go to rumble.studio/workshop, then that's a free course. It's a video plus some templates you can download. They basically ask you all the questions that you should answer before you record your first episode. And this is probably the mistake that most podcasters do, is that they get excited about the idea of doing a podcast, grab a mic, record something, probably put it on Anchor, and then it doesn't sound that great. So then they struggle with editing it and making it a bit better. And then they decide, actually, it's a lot of work. I'm just not going to continue. Whereas if you do those steps at the beginning, you've got a clear, you'll establish a clear idea of why you're doing it, what you hope to gain. You establish your goals, what it is that your audience is going to gain from it, what your guests are going to gain from it. You have a clear plan, and then you've got a much higher chance of continuing with the podcast, because then you can see it as a project, which is a long-term investment. It's not just a one and done kind of activity. You approach it with the right mindset, and you're much more likely to achieve the goals that you've then set out for yourself. So I'd say that's the biggest tip. And if you're interested, you can go to rumble.studio/workshop, watch the videos and download the checklist if you like.
Awesome. No, I think that's some great insight and definitely helpful and guidance on how to get started. So maybe diving into just a couple questions that came to, at least to my mind as you're talking about it. So, I think a lot of times, some people, I think there's a few motivations. I'm sure they're more than what I'll just list, but one of them is just, hey, I think it'd be fun. I have something to say and I want to share it with the world, right? And just kind of, hey, whether it's politics or religion or points of view or, whatever it is, how to cook or hobbies or whatever it is, you just say, hey, I want to share my thoughts with the world. I think I have something to say that's meaningful. And so in that case, it's a personal passion project. And, it seems like sometimes those work. A lot of times that passion quickly goes away as it becomes a lot more work. And then you also will have a lot of times people do that either if it's part of their business endeavor to reach a new audience, or generate clients, or to showcase their expertise, or, something of that nature. So if we focus kind of on that second, because this one's more for, the inventive journey is a lot of startups and small businesses. So we focus on that. If you're saying as a business, a lot of times it seems to me, at least, that it can be hard to come up with a good topic that you can continue to churn out content. Not churn out content just in, hey, let's just hurry and throw something out there, but meaningful, good content that's going to be interesting to your audience. It's going to be helpful. And so give you an example. So it is by a big one, you probably know Wondery, and they have a big podcast and a platform and everything else. And one of the there's several podcasts that my son and I like to listen to. So one of them is Business Wars, and although we haven't loved the last couple Business Wars episodes because they're kind of different businesses that aren't as interesting, but they used to have one that was for American innovations, and he loved it because it would go through different innovations throughout throughout American history, which was the radio system, or the television, or the automobile, and all these things. And after a while, it seemed like they just kind of ran out of content content because there was only so many interesting innovations that they could come up with that would garner a big enough audience. And so it seemed like, and I don't know, they never told me why they stopped the podcast other than they stopped. But even on a much smaller level, you'll start out and you'll say, okay, as an example, Miller IP law, we do intellectual property. So we'll talk all about intellectual property. And then I probably would get, if I were to do that, we don't have an intellectual property podcast, but if I do that, I would probably run out of things to say at about episode 20 or 25, because there's only so many interesting, at least to me, topics you can talk about the intellectual property. And so how do you go about, if you're looking at it from a business perspective, of setting it up that you're not so broad that you don't have any sort of relation to your business and it really has nothing to do with it, such that it's probably not going to generate any business, but yet also avoid the issue of going so narrow that you're running out of topics and you're not able to really or continue to sustain the content.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a really interesting one. It's a really important one as well. So, you know, when I set up my podcast, the Voice Tech podcast, it was, I made it deliberately broad enough that it wasn't, I didn't constrain myself too much, but still the world of voice technology was quite a small world. When you actually contact the people in it, you know, there's a few hundred people, they all know each other. So it's quite niche in and of itself. I think it depends on the industry that you're in. You wouldn't probably want to set up the marketing podcast, you know, that's too broad. So you have to then niche down and look at the you know, the areas within marketing that you want to focus on. Maybe it's performance marketing, you know, or influencer marketing. If you're doing it as a business, then you really want to think about it from your customer's point of view, assuming that's, you know, that's why you've got a business podcast, you know, an external facing one. Then you're going to want to ask the questions that your audience, your customers or potential customers want answered. And a great way to do that is actually to interview your existing customers and the people in the field, because, you know, if your guests are the same type of people as your audience, then they've already experienced or lived through the things that your audience is interested in. And, you know, if you take it, you know, you take that approach, it's hard to run out of things really, because your audience will always have more questions. There'll always be topics on their minds. There'll always be new trends and new technologies and new events in the news to be able to discuss. And you'll always have that model in mind of, is this relevant to my audience? You know, like, what is it that I'm trying to achieve for me, and what is it I'm trying to achieve for my audience? Yeah, I think and I think there are some podcasts and some concepts that do just run their course. So you know, you described a, you know, a couple there where there's nothing wrong with doing podcasts like that. But if your goal, and this is why you need to make a plan at the beginning, if your goal is to have a podcast that just runs and runs, then you do have to think about the topic that you know, that you're able to get basically an infinite amount of information on. One that's going to just continue to evolve over the months and years, and also ones that could potentially be expanded into adjacent areas as well. So, you know, if you started with influencer marketing, that would go, you know, very nicely with perhaps content marketing. You know, you could branch out into these other areas of marketing that would still be relevant to your audience and would support, you know, the core mission of your product and of your podcast.
No, and I think that's a great takeaway, because I mean, I think that it is one where you have to be have enough foresight to say who is your market. And, you know, I think the interesting thing about, you know, who is your market is, you know, as an example, I'm in IP law, yet my market isn't intellectual property attorneys. Like, I am not selling my services to intellectual property attorneys, because that's not who my customer is. And so if I wanted to, you know, maybe if I was recruiting or I was trying to get new people on board or trying to get talent, then maybe that's a good way to showcase it. But if I'm looking and saying, hey, mine is startups and small businesses, then we need to have a podcast that is broad enough to have ongoing content, and yet is focusing on helping startups and small businesses, or providing content that's interesting to them. And that's why we've set up everything from the Inventive Journey, which talks about the journey of startups and small businesses. We're now doing the Inventive Expert, which is expertise from startups and small businesses. And yet that's broad enough that, you know, there's a lot of topics and a lot of material you can get, and yet it's focused enough that you can actually have something of relevance to what your audience is wanting. So I think that's definitely some some great takeaways on that. Now, one of the things that I thought you'd mention, and it's a little bit to do with you guys' business, and so I'd love to have or hear a little bit more as you share it, is the idea of asynchronous podcasting. So before we get into how to do asynchronous podcasting, it'd probably be help us define what is asynchronous podcasting.
Sure. So asynchronous podcasting, this is a term that we've defined. I think we're the only ones doing it. Rumble Studio, we're unique in the podcasting world in that sense. And it's a slightly controversial idea as well, because some people have a very fixed idea of what podcasting is. It's like what we're doing right now, two people on a mic talking to each other at the same time. Asynchronous podcasting changes that by separating the host and the guest, so that the host, who is often the creator, defines some questions in advance, adds them to our system, Rumble Studio, and then sends the guests a link essentially to what is an online form. So if you think of like Typeform or Google Forms, essentially today, this is pretty much what we've got. You add in different requests, so you can request audio, you can request text, upload images, you can ask multiple choice questions, this kind of a thing. So it's a bit like Typeform, but with the focus on capturing audio from your guest or guests. And then obviously the big advantage is more than one guest can click the link that you send, and each guest that goes in hears the questions in your, either they can read them in text, or they can actually hear you speak them if you've recorded them in advance, and then record their answer. And it's zero pressure. They can take their time. They can think about what they're going to say before they say it, rather than just blurt out the first thing that comes into their mind, like sometimes we all do when we're on a live podcast. And then when they're happy, they can move to the next question. And when they're done, they're done. They can do a few questions today, a few questions tomorrow. It's completely up to them. And that in itself has a number of benefits, because, for the creator and the guest, you don't need to schedule calls, which really take a lot of time. A lot of the time on the podcast, you're listening, right? What you're doing right now is listening to me answer. Sure. You could be doing something else. So maybe you are doing something else, Dylan. I can't see your hands, but it's much more efficient to be able to do this stuff asynchronously, and especially if you want to interview multiple guests. One of the benefits of Rumble is that you can create one interview, let's say 5 standard questions that could be answered by many people of the same kind. Maybe you're interviewing IP lawyers, and then just send it out to your entire database of IP lawyers and have everybody take part in their own time. And that way you might get 100 different interviews in the same space of time as you could only do one. So there's a huge benefit in scalability.
No, and I like that idea. And I'll push back, because I'll caveat it with I think it's an interesting approach and a unique idea. Now, the one I could see I could see the pushback that would be from some people, that they'd be worried that if you were to ask people to just simply, hey, I have a recorded, I'll either give you a question, or I'll just do as you can hear my voice, and then you'll record your own thing. Is you worry about the quality. In other words, one is, are they good enough to articulate the answer? And or because sometimes if you're on a live discussion like this and it's going in a different direction, or you're fumbling, I can give some prompts, or I can jump in, or I can rephrase a question and kind of aid the podcast along. Whereas if it's asynchronous, it's a little bit, I'm not there to help guide it along, or to help make sure it's a success. And so you worry, are they going to give enough quality? And yet if I have someone that goes through the time and effort to actually record it and go through that, I don't want to just blow them off and not not use their audio or not use their answer, because I don't think it's good enough to make for an episode. And so how do you gauge, or how do you manage the quality, or how do you make it so that it is a good or still good product while you're not able there to help to manage or guide them through that process?
Yeah, so this is one of the key things we're working on at Rumble. Obviously, we're creating this format, and we're working with our community to improve it all the time. So some of the techniques that we've learned, one of which is start with a good question. There are ways to write questions well that get good answers. So you can write open questions, you can write compound questions, and we actually have written some blogs on this to help the guest to be able to answer well. Obviously, asking questions that a guest can answer that's relevant to their expertise also really helps. And then you have to bear in mind that also when you're recording asynchronously, often you're interviewing lots of guests at the same time. So you're capturing a lot of audio, and you don't have to use all of it in your final production. So if some guests fumble, then you just don't have to use those answers. You can take the best bits from each of your guests and put those into episodes. The third one I would say is that we're actually developing an AI layer to this. This asynchronous system we've got right now is simply a stepping stone to the ultimate vision of Rumble, which is a true two-way real-time conversation between really between three parties: the creator, the guest, and Rumble Studio. And the way it's going to work is, you would set your first 5 questions, you send them to your guest, they listen to question number 1, give their answer, but then Rumble Studio listens to that answer, analyzes what was said, and then responds either with a new follow-up question based on what they said, generated in real time, and asking them for more information, maybe to define an acronym, to clarify what they said, just to expand, and that way you capture more audio with no more effort. Or to provide some kind of coaching, which is what you were alluding to earlier, which is, another job of a podcaster. They're not just there to ask question after question. They also encourage, they smile, they ask you to repeat, they ask you to, stop tapping the microphone, or stop, eating crisps while you're while you're answering the questions. There's a lot of things that we can do on an automatic basis to be able to detect whether whether to provide coaching instead of a follow-up question. So we could say things like, could you please say that again and move closer to the microphone? Or, we can detect some noise in the background. Can you close the window? Or can you speak a little bit louder? Things like this. And so this is what we're building into Rumble Studio, is both the ability to follow up with a question, but also the ability to coach and help the guest present themselves in the best possible way. This is what, a podcaster's job is.
No, makes perfect sense. So now one other question that it would come to mind is, because it sounds like, what you're, and by all means, correct me where I'm wrong, but what you're doing is you're taking, you could ask, and I'm making up 10 questions that they can hear the audio, or they could hear the question or read it, and they'll do it. And you may not use all those 10 questions, or you may splice, or you may grab snippets. And if they answer one question that takes 10 minutes and you're saying, hey, we want to make this more concise down to 1 minute, then you're going to have to edit and otherwise do that. Now, it seems like, if I go out and hire a company to do that, then they're going to be expert and they can do that. They can make it look polished, make it look nice. But two questions arise. One is, if I'm just trying to get my own podcast going, I have a very small budget and I'm not able to go hire someone yet, not because I wouldn't love to, but just budgets don't allow. Then it becomes a bit almost more time consuming to go that direction than as opposed to recording it live. Is that the case? Does it become one where you're spending more time editing it and trying to make it all splice together than if you did it live? Or is there a benefit, or kind of any thoughts on kind of how you'd approach that, especially if you're not in the position where you're going to be able to hire someone that can do all that editing for you?
Well, no, absolutely. So Rumble Studio is designed for people who've never created an interview, never run an interview, never created audio for in their lives. We're a true end-to-end platform that's going to help you plan, record, edit, and publish a podcast without having to go via an expert. Most people out there can't afford to hire a podcast producer or podcast editor, but they've got interesting things to say. And this is really the driving mission behind Rumble Studios, to democratize audio content creation and allow everybody, individuals and companies, to be able to make audio and invite guests, customers, colleagues, friends, experts, thought leaders to contribute. And so they're able to transmit the ideas that they want to on the audio channels of the future without having to break the bank or turn it into a full-time job, which podcasting often does. One of the things I would say about the editing as well is that because it's asynchronous, the guests take their time. Like I say, they think about what their answers are going to be in advance. And people are typically perfectionists when they hear their own voice. As you know, especially when you first start out, you record, you listen back, you're like, oh no, I've got to delete that. They delete it and then they do it again. I guess guests can be the same. And so they might give it 2 or 3 takes before they're like, okay, that's the answer I'm happy with. I'll let that one go and move on to the next question. Which means you actually, as a creator, you get cleaner audio back, which means less editing because the guests already kind of pre-edited it for you. And so you in Rumble Studio, we have a mix feature, so you can drag and drop all the segments in. We give you the transcript as well, so you can quickly scan read what the guests have said. So you can have a quick look and say, oh yeah, that looks like an interesting answer. Preview it, and then drag it into your mix. Then you can drag it up and down, assemble it, add in a few jingles, drop in a comment if you want to respond to what the guest said as well, and then you export. And so the whole thing is designed so you don't have to edit waveforms, you don't have to download or learn how to use an audio editor, and you definitely don't need to go via a freelancer or an agency in order to get a decent quality result.
No, makes perfect sense, and definitely get that there sounds like there's a lot of great advantages to asynchronous. I don't know that there's only, it sounds like, and I don't know, maybe you are saying it and I'm putting words in your mouth that you're saying that I shouldn't be putting there, but it doesn't, I don't know that you'd have to do one or the other. In other words, it seems like, and it even sparks in my mind, hey, it would be kind of fun to have an asynchronous portion of a podcast, or a follow-on or bonus questions or other things that you may let them do it, and you can do part of it as still, if you like to do live in the conversation, and you like that discussion, you can have part of it
You got
being
it.
live or discussion, and part of it being asynchronous, and you can mix and match.
Absolutely.
And so certainly sounds like it gives a lot more flexibility and options.
Yeah, and we've got users who are using Rumble for pre-screeners, so it's kind of an intake for their live conversation. They use it to catch up with guests that they've interviewed live. Maybe 6 months later, you want to get an update from me, but it's not worth doing another full live interview. You can just send me a quick interview and on Rumble, and just get a few sound bites that you can roll into a future episode. And you can play clips of audio that you've recorded on Rumble in your live interviews as well, so that your live guests can respond to those. So there's a lot of ways you can mix and match it. And we've had podcasters tell us that they just want to break from live interviews, because that, it really is, once you start that sequence, it's grueling, and you don't want to drop off the radar for 3 months because your listeners will think you've packed it all in. But at the same time, you are tired, you need a break, you're going to burn out. So async can be a way to combat that as well.
No, and I like that. And I think there is. I mean, that's like, and I don't know that it's specific to podcasts, but if you're doing podcasts are intensive, because you always feel like you have to be on your game, so to speak. You always have to be live and personable and have witty things. And I'm not witty, but hopefully I do a good enough job. But you have to have things questions to ask, follow up things, making comments, and all those things in order to make it interactive, make the guests feel at ease, make the podcast go well, and on and on. And so while it can be fun and enjoyable, it also is taxing. And so I certainly get that it's a great way that you can maybe intersperse. Sometime maybe you do a once a month, we'll do a live, once a month, we'll do asynchronous, or whatever the frequency, or once a week, or once a day, or however often you do it. But I love that it gives kind of those options of, you don't have to all do it one way, and you can be flexible and explore doing it different ways and mixing that up. So I think that's a great idea and some great options. Well, we haven't even touched most of the other things, and we're already running up against towards the end of the podcast. So I'm going to forego, and maybe we'll have to have you on too. We have for all the listeners who are probably aware, we have a series of podcasts where we highlight different things. So we'll have to have you back on and maybe discuss some of the other things on one of the other sister podcasts. But I'll ask one question, or before we wrap up with my final question, but the pre-question to the final question, which is, now if you're saying, maybe you do the top one or two don'ts of a podcast. So, and there's a lot of do's. We've kind of already talked a lot of those, but if you're thinking about starting a podcast, what would be kind of maybe your top one or two, don't do this, or make sure to avoid this in order to be a success? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say a mistake that a lot of new podcasters make is to record one episode and then release it. I think what that sets you up is you're always chasing your tail. You're always panicking to record the next episode. You've released one, you think, well, I've decided to release a weekly episode, so now I've got exactly 1 week to find a guest, record, edit, release. That is a really stressful position to put yourself in, and I would highly recommend you don't do it. It's one of the many reasons why you should create a plan. So download that workshop if you can. And I would say batch episodes. So make a plan for the first 6, for example. It's a manageable number, or even the first 3. But I think 6 is a great one to start with. Decide what you want to say over those 6 episodes. Identify a guest or 2 for each one. Go ahead and record them all. Listen to them, edit them all, get your jingles sorted, get your website up and running, go do your social media and everything, like prepare it, then release the first episode, tell everybody, and then a week later or 2 weeks later, you can release the second one. No stress, because it's ready. And once you've got those 6 in your pocket, you release them. Then you can take a bit of a break if you want. You can say, right, I'll be back in a couple of months or whatever, and do another batch. And async is a great way of doing this, because you can create one interview, send it to 6 people, get enough content for 6 episodes, edit that in a batch. And this is what all the professionals I speak to do. They've probably learned the hard way, like I did, by releasing one at a time. But everyone I know in the industry batches these episodes, whether it's for clients or for their own podcast.
No, and I think that's a great point, because I do think that it is stressful. you're thinking, how have I even, or how am I going to forever get those guests? And especially, I said, if you have someone that is, running it all for you, they probably have experience and they have contacts and maybe they can do it. But if you're doing it on your own, you're thinking, I have to find a new guest every week, and I have to find that guest, get them scheduled, do the episode, do the editing, and I'll get it all released. It's a lot to do. So I do like the idea of batching it, especially when you're getting up and going. Sometimes they create their own momentum and then it gets a little bit easier and you can make it a little more consistent. But certainly for the first one, first several and getting started, I think that's definitely a great thing to avoid and thing to keep in mind. So now with that, we will jump to the last question I always ask at the end of each episode, which is, within your industry, what is the biggest myth and why is it wrong?
Well, I think that the biggest myth, the thing that stops a lot of people from even getting started in podcasting, is that people think that you need a lot of inherent things. For example, that you need a good voice, you need a great personality, you need to have something, like super clever to say every time. You need to be super witty, like you were saying. You need to buy expensive equipment so you sound, studio quality all the time. And I just think that's wrong. Like, you really don't need that much to get started in podcasting, and you don't need to be anyone special, like, because you've already got something special and unique to say. You just need to be able to express it in the right way. And really, the only way that you get good at expressing things in the right way is with practice. So I would say just start with what you've got, start small. But do start. That's get over the hurdle of episode 1. Ideally, like I say, do a little batch so that you can build that momentum straight from the start. If you've got a handful of episodes and you're releasing them consistently, now you're a podcaster. You're not someone who's just made one podcast episode, but now you got a real podcast. And some podcasts out there only have 6 episodes, and they do very well anyway. And so my feeling is that if you get good guests, assuming you're doing an interview one, if you get good guests and you ask good questions for that guest and you get good sound quality, you don't need to get an expensive mic and sound like you did it in a fancy studio. But as long as people can hear what you're saying without straining, then you're going to have a great podcast. Good guests, good questions, good sound equals great podcast. That's my takeaway there.
No, and I think that that's definitely some great takeaways. Now, I'll give you the caveat. If it is terrible sound quality, then it can be bad, because I think it's more, people are willing to be reasonably understanding, but if they're having to strain to hear or strain to understand, I think it just causes mental fatigue. So, and yet, a decent microphone setup isn't very expensive. I think people have in their mind that, hey, I have to have, a dedicated room that's all sound deadening. I have to have the perfect background, perfect setup, perfect microphone, perfect lighting if you're doing video and all that. And you have to do it. You have to do a minimum amount. You don't want it to be so terrible that it makes you look bad or sounds bad. But that is a far cry from what you don't have to have professional level, especially not to get started. Now, you always typically, if it's going great and you're really garnering a big audience, you can always upgrade along the way. But I think that that's a great myth to dispel. So, with that, if people want to reach out to you, they want to be a customer, they want to be a client, they want to be an employee, they want to be an investor, they want to be your next best friend, any or all of the above, what's the best way to reach out to you, contact you, find out more?
Yep. So you can email me, Carl@rumble.studio. That's CARL@rumble.studio. If you want to download the workshop, like I say, it's at rumble.studio/workshop. We did a webinar recently where we really dive into the nuts and bolts of how to make an asynchronous podcast. That's at rumble.studio/how-to. And if you visit our site, there's plenty more resources there to tell you everything you need to know about async podcasting and all the rest.
Awesome. Well, I definitely encourage people to check out all the great resources, reach out to Carl, and if nothing else, make a new best friend. So with that, thank you again, Carl, for coming on the podcast. It's been fun. It's been a pleasure. Now, for all of you that are listeners, if you can do us a favor and help us to make sure that even more startups and small businesses get access to all this expertise by just clicking share, subscribe, and leave us a review. That really makes it so that we can help as many startups and small businesses as possible. And with that, if you ever need help with your patents, your trademarks, or anything else with your startup, your small business, just reach out to us. Go to strategymeeting.com, grab some time with us to chat, and we're always here to help. Well, thank you again, Carl, for coming on the podcast, and wish the next leg of your journey even better than the last.
It's a pleasure. Thanks very much, Devin. Take care.